Welcome to the Culture and Sports Podcast, where we have discussions about how leadership and organizational culture impact organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long term mental, physical, and emotional health of athletes. The Culture and Sports Podcast is brought to you by Culture and Sports. Culture and Sports helps sports organizations, teams, coaches, support and front office staff, and athletes understand the importance of leadership and organizational culture and its direct impact to success. Please join Robert Boland and Dr. Jeremy Piasecki in this season of the Culture and Sports Podcast.
Hi, everybody. It's Bob Boland. I'm back for the Culture and Sports Season 5 podcast. This year, we're kind of dissecting the future of college athletics, and I'm really excited to have the person that we're talking to today, Michael Shue. Michael's a former regent at the University of Minnesota. He is an entrepreneur, but he's also somebody who has become deeply connected with the success and plight of college athletes, setting up players' associations in both football and basketball and being active about the need for employment status as we move forward. He's truly one of the real thought leaders in the collegiate athletic space, and we're really lucky to have him. Welcome, Michael.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Michael, I think the first question is, let's start. Let's just start in what's front of mind for you at the present state of college athletics right now in the fall of 2024.
Well, thank you, Bob. The last week, we had the House settlement. We've had various ideas about what groups have for moving football forward. There's a whole lot of other sports, including football, that need to be worked on. Everyone's trying to figure out what's going on with the House settlement. But the House settlement is really, we can talk about that, but that's really the kind of the thing that's going to lead us to the next horizon, which is employment status and how employment status is going to play out. And that's really kind of the thing that I've been interested in, and the thing that I've been
fascinating. You've been an advocate.
Sorry, I think I didn't hear that.
Michael, no, we've got a little bit of delay. Michael, you've been an advocate for employment status, and you did say House, at least in your mind, is a stepping stone to that next horizon. Can you talk about how?
Well, it's a stepping stone because that's what the NCAA says it is. It's a stepping stone for them to kind of get clear, and I think I've heard their attorneys say that they think the settlement binds everyone together for at least 10 years, and they want to then address the other topics which they're trying to, basically stop, which is employment status. And employment status has been something that Congress has talked about. In fact, about a year ago, Congress had one of their many committee hearings where they asked everyone, "Oh, what's the thing that is the most significant in your mind in terms of the challenges to college sports?" And almost everyone said employment status. But guess what? It wasn't an employment status hearing. So we're in a world now where the House settlement clears a way for employment status to be kind of the next thing that they either lobby for or they get court judgments on, or whatever. We don't know how it's going to play out. I happen to think that it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and it's going to take years to resolve that while the House settlement is in place. That's important because of collective bargaining, which is what I think the real solution is for college sports.
That's a fascinating take. And you're sanguine enough to say it could take years. It'll end up in the Supreme Court, and the House settlement becomes that sort of intermediate step to allow you to get there. I'm fascinated by that. How did you come to be aware of the need for employment? I've had lots of conversations with friends over the years to say that college athletics leaves athletes in a state that is maybe less than employment. Things that where they don't have Title VII rights, they don't have unemployment rights, they don't have other rights. and they don't have certain rights of grievance as unionized employees would. So why have we resisted it so long? When did the idea germinate for you? And what do you see the advantages at the ultimate end of it?
Well, it goes way back for me because even when I was in college, now I was a high school athlete. I played football until I got injured in my freshman year and decided to focus on swimming. My swim coach was really happy to hear that. But I had friends that played football into college, and when I went to college, I joined a fraternity at the University of Minnesota where we had a lot of athletes. In fact, one of my roommates was on the diving team at the university. So I had a chance to really observe kind of from the outside, kind of what was going on with these guys and what they had to deal with as college athletes. And it was, for a long time after that I, obviously thought about it every time March Madness rolled around. And it wasn't until I joined the Board of Regents, which was in 2015, where the issue kind of Northwestern unionizing was kind of just kind of being finalized in I think August of 2015. And so I was aware that there were issues with, employment status and how collective bargaining would work if in fact the Northwestern football players were able to get a union, et cetera. And then that got shut down. And then at the University of Minnesota, we had a boycott of the football. I guess it was a boycott at the end of the season, right before the Holiday Bowl game. So it was in early December. And I had gotten calls. I had dealt with other unionization issues within the university as a regent. In fact, I was, in one example, the faculty wanted to unionize and they wanted to meet with regents, and I was the only regent who met with them and agreed that they should have an opportunity to vote. But the question is, what is the unit? What does the unit look like? The bargaining unit look like? And so that's where I found, I was sitting on the Board of Regents, and we had hired an expensive law firm to basically try and block it. And their strategy was basically to mess around with who's in the unit, who's not in the unit, in order to try and get a unit that's favorable for the university. If in fact they were able to vote, they would probably not get the votes. So, I saw the kind of anti-union efforts from the university on that side. And then with the boycott, I spent a Friday night into Saturday morning, about 16 hours total with the football team. And, when you're sitting around talking to the football team for that period of time, you really learn about kind of the issues they dealt with. And I kind of felt they were being treated unfairly. They had no rights. They were being told to play in a bowl game that the university had accepted the invitation to, and there were reasons why they were unhappy and they stopped practicing. And so I sat with them on a Friday night into Saturday morning, and we talked about all the things that they wanted and did they want to play. I kind of joked with them, and it was really just the senior leadership team. But I joked with them. I said, "Hey guys, I mean, do you guys want to play? I mean, I'm willing to help you either way. And by the way, you only need 11 players to play." And so that was kind of a joke. It broke the ice. And so I think they realized that I was going to help them regardless of whether they wanted to play or not play. And so through this kind of evening, 16 hours, and we weren't sleeping. Okay, we didn't sleep. So during the 16 hours, there was a lot of discussion about, the things that they thought, they should have in terms of rights. The thing that I was focused on during the time was the lack of due process. And this had to do with how several players were treated by the student conduct code and by law enforcement, and by all the different parties that would be involved in a case involving athletes. And I've always had a problem with them being called student athletes. And I did do research, and I did learn that Walter Byers kind of invented the term, 50 or 70 years ago. And he invented it expressly to avoid liability in cases. And there was I think was the Denison case. There was a case in Colorado, a case in Texas, where they were basically trying to escape liability for workman's comp, and they didn't want to pay workman's comp, which, by the way, I've heard that's an issue, but nobody's ever told me what they think the number is for the cost of workman's comp. So I always thought that was interesting that nobody's ever come up with that number. But my perspective is, hey, it's the players that score the points.
I was going to say it's a generalized fear in that area, right? Not a direct. We got a quote and it will put us out of business situation.
Sure. Yeah. And, and I had followed the graduate school case, the graduate teaching assistants cases at Columbia and other, I think there's another Ivy League, maybe it was Brown, but I followed those cases.
It was Brown, ultimately. The Supreme Court ruled on. Yep.
Yes. And I think they flip-flopped on Columbia, though, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway,
Columbia was the Columbia had gone the other way. Yes.
Yes. And so I was just interested in this area, and I felt that, hey, this is really a problem in that, and I was, when I dealt with the Minnesota players, I was really only interested in kind of the due process part of it. I learned a lot about kind of the whole thing through that process. And then later on, we dealt with while I was on the board, we dealt with Title IX, and Title IX was used this is during the pandemic. And I think during the session last week, I mentioned the fact that during the pandemic, we learned that college athletes are, at least football and basketball, are essential workers. I think a lot of people like to forget that whole episode, but for the University of Minnesota, when the Big Ten decided not to play football, it was a big deal for us. It was like a $75 million loss because there would be no television rights. So we ended up, as everyone knows, playing 8 games of the 12 or so, and we were paid $42 million. So our loss during the pandemic was only $25 million. That had to be subsidized by the university general fund to the athletic department. So there's a loan to the athletic department. Other schools had bigger loans. We all know about Arizona and UCLA and the rest of the Pac-12 and how they were starving for money, and and then that the conference realignment with USC and UCLA kind of followed Texas and Oklahoma, and kind of redefining the conferences into what we know as the Power Four today. So it's been an interesting thing, and I was going to say Title IX was an element towards the end of my Regent career. The athletic director wanted to cut 4 men's sports and save about $1.5 million, which is pocket change, right, these days. But I think part of it was, they just felt that Minnesota had one of the most, I think we had 25 sports at the time, which is nothing compared to like Ohio State and Michigan, which I think is kind of where people are kind of looking now with the House settlement. How many sports should we have? How much should we fund them if we have them? And so there's just a lot of things going on related to all this stuff. But through that, we were able to save one of the men's track sports, the outdoor track. We had just built a new track, by the way. And the indoor track team was cut, as was men's gymnastics and men's tennis. So very little savings there. There's very little money involved in the non-revenue men's sports and some of the non-revenue women's sports as well. The House settlement is putting pressure on universities to determine what sports they're going to continue to sponsor going forward. And there's the Title IX element of that, which is another kind of story that we can go down.
Now, Michael, I wanted to ask you a few questions solely for the audience to best understand some of these terms that you're using and what their role is in this discussion. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was, what is a bargaining unit and why is that important?
Well, a bargaining unit is basically who's going to be involved in the union, or at least part of the union. So I mean, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on that, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, so like would it just be in the cases you were saying, would it be one bargaining unit would be football players and one would be basketball players and then another bargaining unit would be track and field and swimming, or is it all athletes that are together in one bargaining unit at one university or college?
Well, so that's the question that has to be answered. We know that the men's basketball team at Dartmouth has actually received union status. They went through the hearing. They were challenged. They went through the NLRB hearing. The regional
Mm-hmm.
director in Boston made the decision that they were in fact employees, which I think is the right answer. Now, if the women on at Dartmouth wanted to unionize, they would possibly have their own union, or they could try to expand the men's basketball union to include the women, and maybe even try to have two bargaining units inside there. I mean, it's there's Bob,
Mm-hmm.
you're the lawyer on this call. There's lots of ways that this could go. I think eventually there are a lot of people who talk about unions as if there was going to be a whole pro style union for the NCAA or for a conference. But that would be a huge union. If it was for the NCAA, it could be as much as 500,000 members, or maybe just 100,000 members, or maybe even just 10,000 members, depending on who wants to be in it. But I'll just give you a little story, and you can tell me if this is useful or not. When I first started talking to Dartmouth, it was just the dining workers I was talking to, because the dining workers in May of I think 22 unionized. They were not opposed by Dartmouth. Dartmouth, the president at the time. Now keep in mind, Dartmouth has changed presidents since then, but the president at the time just let them unionize. And so I called them up and I was talking to the guys who were involved in that, not knowing that they had a basketball player, Cade Haskins, who has since come out and said that he is also a dining worker in addition to being a basketball player. And at the time, the guy I was talking to happened to know some athletes, and he didn't really specify. I think maybe they were football, basketball, etc. Type players, and I asked them if they were interested in unionizing, because I didn't know any kids or students at Dartmouth at the time, and he said that he thought that maybe they would, and we had a long discussion many times. And what happened at the end of the day was they basically thought that they could use, I guess the term is accretion, to add the basketball players onto the dining workers union. And I told them I didn't think would work, because their interests were different, their treatment was different. Anyway, it turned out that they ended up going to try and unionize themselves. They went with SEIU, the SEIU local, who is already on campus, and was being led by someone on the maintenance side. And it all worked out well. I think they used the resources of SEIU and their lawyer, and um, they went through the process, and actually got the approval by the regional director in Boston. So that worked out well. But that tells you, that story, just in a little small form, tells you that there's a long way to go on this. All the
Mm-hmm.
Ivy Leagues Ivy League basketball teams could be a union, although Princeton has come out and said they don't want to be part of it, and other schools I think also have said that. So I think we're in this, and I've thought about this a lot. I knew it had to start somewhere, and that's one reason I started the Basketball Players Association, because I knew the numbers were better for unionization at the team level, because you only have 12 to 15 players. And in order to get a union, you just need 50% plus one. So I knew the numbers were better for basketball than for football. And it's just, we're in such a weird space right now, because we're waiting for the USC case, which was not one of the ones that I filed, but the USC case only involves football and men's women's basketball. Whereas the other charges that I filed, which include the NCAA, Northwestern, Dartmouth, the Ivy League, and Notre Dame, all of those, have to be private schools, which they are, or private organizations, which they are, but they're for all sports, for all of those programs. So I really started with the NCAA, which was all 500,000 athletes at one time. And I'm basically waiting for the NCAA and or the other parties to figure out what they're going to do, which is going to probably have to wait until the USC case. First of all, they have to get judgment by the LA regional director, and then obviously you're going to see the same things that are happening with Dartmouth, and hopefully that happens.
Now, Michael, even if the Supreme Court does figure this out, isn't it up to the states of how they'll classify the employees, what the wages for those employees would be, and what taxes and tax liability and workman's comp and other insurances? Won't the states have to work on that as well?
I'm not a legal. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not a legal expert on this particular subject, but I would say that states will be involved. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is the joint employer theory, which is the theory that I was trying to put forward and have the NLRB work on because the first charge I filed was against the NCAA. And so there are a number of public and privates, and the private school issue was one of the reasons why the NLRB made their decision to not go forward with Northwestern. So they didn't accept the case, which allowed it to die. And but it's the joint employer theory that really has to come out, and we have to figure out how to deal with that in terms of whether or not they're employees. Now, once they're employees, I think at the federal level, I think then the states have to figure out how they're going to deal with their stuff. But the federal government is in charge of at least the federal taxation issue. And anytime anyone brings up taxes, I kind of just think, oh, well, that's kind of like a red herring at this point, because we don't really know. I mean, everyone knows that if they make money, they're going to have to pay taxes, right? And the question is going to be at what rate, and then whether or not you have deductions to offset, some of that income. So it's really not a conversation for now, because once we determine they're employees, a lot of other things are going to happen. You might have OSHA, you might have other federal agencies weigh in on, safety, health and safety, and et cetera. So there's just so much that happens once they become employees. And I think obviously this is a 70 plus year misclassification. It started with Walter Byers. It's still a problem today, and hopefully it gets solved within my lifetime.
Of course, no, a decision is definitely needed. Regardless of what the decision actually is, I think a decision does need to move forward. But let's go back to simple terms. Let's define what an employee is. Is it something where athletes are required to attend practices and games at certain times? They're required to be at certain locations? Are they required to wear certain attire? Meals that they're eating are being provided. What actually entails what an employee is?
Well, if you go by the definition from Jennifer Bruzo and in her 21-08 memo, it's really just simply the control of somebody's time. So that's really a common law um, theory, which is, hey, look, if you control my time, then I'm your employee. And a lot of people argue with that because then, for a lot of years, there's the issue of, oh, but is it a revenue? Is there revenue involved? Is there compensation involved? And all those things. And I think her position is no, but later on, when other people get to weigh in on it, compensation might be a factor. They did look at the compensation of the Dartmouth basketball players. In that particular case, they're given a lot of, things like uniforms, and they're given early acceptance, or at least some kind of Ivy League acceptance, which frankly it has the most value of anything, right? If you're accepted into an Ivy League school, you're bypassing the traditional process to get special admittance, the early letter or whatever it is. And in addition to that, they get other services like I think there was I can't remember the name of it, but Dartmouth has a type of uh, I guess it's workout facility or something that may have special food in it as well. But they have a special program just for athletes to participate in that normal athletes can't participate in. Plus, they get the travel to the trips and all the meals and stuff along the way, in addition to their training table or whatever they get while they're on campus.
The Dartmouth basketball team, they try to create a bargaining unit, and they wanted to be recognized as employees. Now, were they just asking for themselves to be recognized as employees, or were they asking for all athletes at Dartmouth to be recognized as employees?
Just basketball.
Okay, so if basketball were to be considered employees, why wouldn't the athletes from every single other sports not also be classified as employees? If the requirements are the same, they have to their time is controlled as a basic employment classification. If their time is controlled, doesn't that apply to all athletes who would be considered employees?
Well, if they wanted to, they could have submitted their own petitions for their other teams. If in fact the appeal goes, I don't know how. Maybe the Supreme Court appeal would have to be what it would take to actually define them as employees once and for all. And then at that point, the other ones could uh, file their own petitions, and I would think that Dartmouth would not argue with that. Although they probably will. They'll probably say, "Oh, these are not the same. These fencing athletes. We don't have any revenue to cover them, and we're not. We're going to just say they're different for whatever reason." And they will probably do that. So that's why this is a very slow process. It may be 20 years before we see a consolidation of all of these into the same unit. But as you can see, uh, a lot of them have different things to. They all have similar things, but they also have a lot of different things that they are worried about, or they may be concerned about. For example, sports that cross multiple seasons as opposed to sports that are, or multiple semesters as opposed to sports that are in the same semester. There's academic things that you worry about in one and you don't worry about in the other. And, so I don't know. Like I said, there's a lot of things that can be bargained. And it would depend on what your team actually does and how you're treated at your particular school. So I think even going across schools is going to be tough. Across schools in a conference is going to be tough.
Mm-hmm.
Having all sports within a school in a union is also going to be tough because of what's common and what's not common between the athletes.
Michael, it's fascinating you point to that because two of the things that opened my eyes about the summit were two pieces of information that came out on the last panel where Andy Schwartz believed that it would be a big economic mistake to have a mixed union in place, to have a union any larger than a single sport at most, because of the differences and challenges of creating this together. You alluded to that early on. And then the idea that Michael Leroy, the labor professor, made the comment that the NCAA or another group of joint employers could just unilaterally recognize these people as union employees and solve a lot of the concerns going on. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of to digest those and put your own spin on those, if that's okay.
Well, I agree with Andy, and I'm not sure exactly what Andy said. Did he say one sport at a school, or did he say one sport across a conference? Because those are two different things.
He thought no bigger than one sport across a conference would be the largest unit he could possibly imagine to not be weak.
Right, I would agree with that. I think that is the probably the largest you could go. So that would be like a Big Ten football conference, or a Big Ten conference with a union of just football. Because that would be 18 teams times 100 and whatever the roster limit happens to be at the time. Let's say 105. So that's a pretty large union. But I look at the pro leagues, and I look at the specifically. So in the pro leagues, every player in a league is in the same union. Okay, so all of the NFL football players, they're all in the NFLPA, same union, across all the teams. So you look at the owners look at the league, and they basically say, oh, well, we've got all these players, and it doesn't matter who they're playing for. We have to treat them all the same, right? What was an eye opener for me was actually the men's and women's national soccer teams in the U.S., right? Because a lot was made of the women kind of getting their pay parity. But when I figured out that they actually each had their own union, I stopped worrying about it, because I looked at it and I said, oh, so the women bargained, and they basically got a deal that they don't like anymore. Well, what happens when that's the case? Well, you have to wait till the next contract, right? But they enlisted the help of the men to help them bargain for pay parity. So the men in a separate union, although they have the same employer, came to their rescue and basically said, hey, we agree with the women, and you guys should treat us equally, or as equal as possible. And that's how they achieved that. Those were two separate unions. So I actually looked at that and I said, well, for men's and women's basketball, would it be better if they were all in the same union, or would it be better if they were in separate unions? And I looked at it and I actually said, from a voting perspective, in theory, you could actually have an advantage by putting men's and women's basketball together, right? Even though there would be arguments about whether or not they actually should be together because of the revenue and all that kind of stuff that comes in through those sports separately. But in my view, it was like, hey, maybe that would be interesting, because I was running around before the Northwestern men's basketball team filed their petition. I was running around telling people quietly that I thought the Dartmouth women would be the first. And it turned out not to be that way, for one reason or another, because athletes these days they don't know a lot about the process. They don't know a lot about kind of the ins and outs of it. They've been part of teams their whole lives, and they've just been kind of brainwashed into thinking that they shouldn't They shouldn't ask for that. Okay. Now, it could be their parents telling them not to ask for it. It could be their former coaches telling them to ask for it. It's just an interesting dynamic these days. And that's why education about unionization and collective bargaining is such a big deal. But most of these players realize that if they go pro, they're going to join a union, right? And so it's just a strange kind of place to be right now. But I think the more this topic kind of gets discussed as the House settlement kind of is in its, it's in its real kind of legitimate settlement phase right now. Education about employment status is probably going to pick up. And it's just great to hear so many people talking about employment status now. Because they weren't before. And before it was kind of, oh, no, that'll never happen. Or, it'll never happen for non-revenue sports, So, but now I think everyone is going to start talking about it because it is kind of going to be the main focus of the college sports world as we go forward.
Michael, without asking you to go into great detail, but what would you summarize the pitch to a prospective athlete in a prospective bargaining unit? What would you say to a group of basketball players at a private university out there considering now the possibility of unionization? What are the benefits? How would you overcome their doubts? What would you say to assure them?
Well, it's not a one size fits all thing, because I think if you get into actually bargaining for things, it's going to be what they think are going to be important. So I would ask them, what is important to you that you think should be on the table in terms of collective bargaining if you were to get to the table? It could come down to just a basic salary. It could come down to healthcare considerations. It could come down to the control, the time that you have to spend to be on a team. It could come down to the educational factors, like how are we going to deal with your education as you're participating in a team sport. It could be anything. There are a lot of things that I would take from the pro list of items bargained. The transfer portal is actually a big one, I think. And the transfer portal is something that is created now. Actually, most people don't realize this, but the transfer portal kind of was the first thing to come into effect that affected athletes in a big way. It was before the Alston decision. It was before NIL. It was early on. And now, if you look at the fact that once you give them NIL, it really gives them the ability to move schools and to improve their situation by improving their the amount that they get paid. And that's what really, it's the combination of the two, the transfer portal and NIL, that has really turned everything upside down and forced coaches like Nick Saban out of the game because he didn't want to worry about who's going to be on his team next year. So it's really kind of, to answer your question, I don't think I really answered it, but I did try and throw some big items out there. The fact that the transfer portal is being limited and redesigned, every time we turn around, that's one thing that probably should be collectively bargained. But the question is, can you collectively bargain the transfer portal with a particular school? You would need to have at least a conference or the NCAA at the table in order to deal with that. And of course, there are going to be people who are going to continue suing because they view that as anti-competitive.
So with situations where, we'll use the Dartmouth men's basketball team, you also indicated you were a little surprised that the women's basketball team weren't the first ones to try to unionize. But say you have a men's football program and a men's basketball program at a college or university that are unionized, but none of the women's sports are unionized. Where does Title IX, and before you answer that, we all know Title IX is nebulous at best about anything. It's not clear. It's very short. But where does Title IX and basically discrimination law, and Bob, I'm sure you're going to want to jump in on this too. Where does Title IX and discrimination law fall into unionizing and becoming employees, where one group is definitely going to be an employee, assuming that they win all their lawsuits and they become recognized employee, but then you have what should be an equal number of women athletes who are not?
Well, that's a great question. I think if the men are unionized and the women are not, then you're probably not going to see a lot of benefits for women being negotiated by the men, because they wouldn't even apply to the women. So that's why I was thinking that the greatest thing would be a men's basketball team and a women's basketball team being in the same unit, and let the school tell them that they can't be in the same unit. The school is probably going to come forward and fight that, and then let them fight it, and we'll figure out what's going to happen after that. But I believe that in terms of Title IX will then be used to not give men's teams the benefit in a negotiation. So the school will flip around and say, "Oh, well, we can't give you that because that would cause us Title IX problems." So Title IX is really going to have to be dealt with at some point. And even with the House settlement, Title IX, which actually isn't part of the House settlement, but there's going to be all these issues about how the money gets divvied up, whether it's the back pay money, or the forward-looking money. Title IX is going to come into play, and there are schools. Most schools are saying that they're not going to basically utilize Title IX in determining how they're going to pay or provide the NIL revenue share portion, which is the $22+ million pot going forward per school. And so I think the men are going to continue to get more money there, and hopefully it fuels a unionization effort by the women. I'm waiting for that to happen. The women, once they figure out what's going on, might just say, "Hey, we need to unionize if we want to actually get to the table and start negotiating about this stuff." So I think the House settlement really sets up this whole thing on employment status, both for both men and women. But I think the women should wake up and actually say, "Hey, wait a second. If we want to get to the table, we gotta be in a union."
Michael, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about your experience as a regent, and talk to you the state of trustees and regents in college athletics, or overseeing college athletics on the variety of campuses, and get some of your views with that. But I wanted to start, what possessed you and you ran for election, right? That was an elected position.
We are in Minnesota. We are elected by the legislature. So you have to proactively fill out a form that says you're a candidate, and then you do whatever candidates do to try and talk to legislatures. And for me, I kind of looked at it and said, because I was involved with my college fraternity when I moved back into town on their house corporation, we were influenced, not influenced, but we were under the influence of the university in a number of ways, even though we were private property owners across the street from the university. So we paid attention to what was going on at the university. And so I felt this closeness, that I understood what was going on with the university just by being a part of our house corporation. And then I basically said, okay, well, the worst case is I get to meet a lot of legislators, and I knew very few at the time, but I said, I'm just going to go and try and meet them. And I went forward with, I had a one page presentation, which was basically the graph that showed tuition going up from 1960 to present day. And in 1960, tuition at the University of Minnesota was $300 a year. Okay. And when I ran in 2015, it was $12,000. So I basically went around with that one sheet of paper, and I said, this is why I'm running for the Board of Regents. Tuition is too damn high, and If we don't do anything now, do something about it now, no one's going to be going to college in another 20 or 30 years, or no one's going to be able to afford to go to college without borrowing huge amounts of money. So I basically got meetings with. So we have 201 legislators in the state, and I basically got meetings with about 140 of them, on both sides of the aisle. And so I was one of the last regents to actually be elected in a bipartisan fashion. So it was an interesting thing. I was not really thinking about athletics at the time. Um, I knew that athletics was part of the deal, but I really didn't understand how athletics worked until I joined the board.
So that was an eye opener for you.
It was an eye opener for a number of reasons, but it was basically an eye opener because um, athletics was basically being run by the president's chief of staff on a day-to-day basis, and I found that to be um, completely baffling. It explained a lot of things. It explained the historic performance of Minnesota teams for sure. The fact that the president of the university was not really hands-on on athletics, other than when he came in, he hired the athletic director, a new athletic director, and tried to change the direction that way. But keep in mind, presidents, when they come into universities, typically have zero athletics experience, or at least big time athletics experience. They might, because they usually come from smaller schools, whether public or private, they just don't seem to have they don't put their time into athletics because keep in mind, to be a president of a university, you typically are a professor. And if you're a professor, that means that you got a PhD, and to have a PhD or a law degree or a medical degree. But typically, if you came up through the ranks in a normal, non-medical and non-legal kind of fashion, you had to have something that you focused on to create something that you could be recognized for and earn a PhD. So that's typically what these presidents are focused on. They're focused on whatever they studied, and then they become maybe a department chair, maybe a dean, and then maybe a provost, and then maybe a university president. But typically, they come in and have no experience unless they were at a previous Power Four, Power Five school.
And a lot of times that becomes a bit of a convenience sample rather than real knowledge into the entity.
Yeah, I mean, they're coming into a new school, they're learning a bunch of things. Athletics has to be one of them. They're meeting with donors who, may or may not have a particular, axe to grind within athletics. So it is a tough job. But there's no question that if you look at how the Pac-12 blew up, those guys were all kind of not really with it. I mean, if you look at Robbins and Crow probably were the longest serving presidents. They were there in the Larry Scott days, and they were there when they changed over to Kliakov. And but if you look at the stuff that is coming out about all of those programs in that conference, you can kind of see why it blew up or how it blew up. I mean, you have presidents sitting in the room pounding the table saying, no, we won't accept $20 million. We want $30 million, and then Kliakov has to go out and try and get, $30 million a school, and he just can't do it.
$30 million.
And then he comes back with a, streaming deal and, all this stuff. Apple gives them a deal where they can earn more money over time if they can help increase the number of subscribers to Apple TV. You look at this stuff and you can just see how the president's eyes are just glazed over, and they have no power really. They can't control what's going on. The TV guys control it, and the TV guys basically said, "Oh, we'll move Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. We'll move USC and UCLA to the Big Ten, and oh, by the way, oh yeah, let's take Washington and Oregon too. So it's like it's funny how this works. It's not a surprise, but it's just funny to kind of actually see it play out over time.
Michael, I've got good news for you. I've got one last question. I
Okay.
wanted to talk to you about the nature of trustees and the oversight of athletics. You tweeted a little bit on that micro system known as X now. I'm still going to call it Twitter, but the idea that there are questions about transparency and real issues, and obviously some of the ones that you're most concerned with your own experience at the University of Minnesota. But do you have any thoughts nationally about the state of trustee oversight, particularly around athletics?
Well, I don't know what tweets you're talking about, but I will say that the future of college athletics should actually be in the trustees' hands to let presidents make these decisions. And this goes back to kind of like how Big Ten football got canceled during the pandemic, right? I was told that our president had to sign a confidentiality agreement with the Big Ten that would preclude her from talking to her trustees about Big Ten business, including the cancellation of football, which ultimately could have been a $75 million reduction in revenue for the University of Minnesota athletics. And so if you take that as an example, and by the way, I did go back to him and I said, well, I'll sign a confidentiality agreement. And of course, I never heard back from our general counsel, who was supposed to be a general counsel for the board of directors. So it's just a scary time in athletics right now. And the TV guys have figured out that they can really kind of shape things. And the conference commissioners, while the conference commissioners actually have presidents and chancellors of the institutions to deal with, they don't. I don't know that they really. I don't know what they really do. I think they basically tell the presidents what's going to happen. Um, it's really a crazy time, and if we want to point the finger back to anybody at the end of this thing, because trustees could turn around and say, "Hey, we're gonna treat our athletes as employees." They can make that decision. The presidents can make that decision along with the trustees. So if you look at it, it's a really sad state of affairs because they're just a bunch of rubber stampers, and they believe that they've hired the college presidents are making a lot of money now, and they're not making as much as athletic directors or college football coaches or basketball coaches, but they're making a lot of money, and they're expected to know how to deal with this stuff. And I think a lot of trustees really don't have the time to dig in, and nor do they really want to because they know how complicated it is. So they tend to listen to what the presidents tell them and what the athletic directors tell them. And it's not enough because those people all know the game, right? They know, oh, I just have to tell them this and I just have to tell them that. And then we can get what we want. But I think that as you're seeing this conference realignment, you're seeing the changes in the television deals, seeing changes in the NCAA legislation and rules and all this stuff. And it's because the trustees have been silent for so long. They've kind of just allowed the presidents to do whatever they want. And the presidents don't know what they want, but they're being told what they want. So if we look at the real problem here, it really starts at the trustee level. And it's not just athletics, it's in a whole bunch of different areas at a university.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today on the Culture and Sports Podcast. Bob and I greatly appreciate it. Before we go, though, I wanted to know if you could share with our viewers and listeners if there was one thing you wanted all of them to know, what would it be?
Well, I think the thing that I like to say is the players score the points. Okay, so the athletes are critical in this whole, whatever you want to call it, this whole business, the whole system of college athletics. You don't get anywhere without the players, and you don't get the players without treating them fairly. There are a lot of people in the past who are suing now because they didn't have NIL, right? And they knew that they deserved something more than what they got at the time. And you're going to see possibly, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm predicting there's going to be an avalanche of lawsuits because I've talked to a lot of people who are mad that they're too old to be in the House settlement. And I tell them, well, just hang around. There's going to be other lawsuits. I don't know what they're going to get, but there's going to be other lawsuits for you old timers. And we know that a lot of those lawsuits have been filed already. Reggie Bush has an interesting lawsuit of his own because of what happened to him and his Heisman Trophy. Frankly, if I were Reggie Bush, I would never have given it back. But for some reason, he felt like he had to give it back. And they didn't give it to anyone else that year, so it's still sitting around somewhere. It's maybe holding a door at the Heisman Foundation. But I would say the players score the points, and you got to take care of the players. And they are employees, they are essential workers. And if you don't take care of them, then you're just going to have a lot less athletics to watch on whatever day. It's like every day of the week there's a college game or event or a tournament or something. So I just think that people need to wise up. I would like to see people do the right thing, honor the values of their institutions. If a trustee were to actually look at the values of their institution, they would say, "Hey, wait a second. We should be treating our athletes as employees." I look at. There's one thing that I didn't mention, we didn't talk about, but I really do think that this is a civil rights issue, and that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. The fact that most of the revenue has been made or earned by the Black athletes, and it's been kind of taken from them. There's an issue of wage theft here, and distributed around to create the system that we have today. And the fact that the NCAA is using the 13th Amendment slavery loophole as an argument in employee status issues, such as the Johnson case, which we didn't talk about. Johnson is potentially another disaster for the NCAA, and that is kind of in a different stage right now, having gone through an interlocutory appeal in the Third Circuit and now back. I think they're going to start a trial sometime next year. But I think all of those issues together gives trustees enough kind of reason to try and figure out the system without using the courts, because you don't have to go to court to actually say, "Hey, we're gonna treat these people as employees. Have them fill out the paperwork. They're employees," and just start treating them as employees. So that could happen today. But trustees at Dartmouth have decided not to do it. Trustees at USC have decided not to do it. Trustees, in other areas, the conferences, which are college presidents, have decided not to do it. So I think you're going to see something interesting happen. I'll just end with the fact that Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurring opinion in the 9-0 decision for Alston, he actually laid out collective bargaining as one possible solution to the issues at hand. And he ended his concurring opinion by saying the NCAA is not above the law. And if that's not enough for people to start thinking about kind of how to deal with these issues without going back to the Supreme Court, I think they should really, take the advice of Justice Kavanaugh and start looking for solutions that they can implement.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode of the Culture and Sports Podcast. We hope that this episode has started an internal dialogue, or even one with your team, about the importance of leadership and organizational culture. If you'd like to learn more about culture and sports, the Culture and Sports Podcast, or other programs, go to cultureandsports.com, where there is a wealth of resources, articles, research, podcasts, video shows, webinars, and courses. And don't forget to connect with us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn at Culture and Sports, and on Twitter at Culture in Sport. Thank you for tuning in to the Culture and Sports podcast.